Welcome back to A Travel Guide to Life. I'm Anthony DeStefano. Today, we're going to talk about something I call the 3 Gs. And these 3 Gs also happen to be 3 keys to peace and happiness. We've got a lot to cover in a very short time, so stay tuned. The 3 Gs, what are they? The first is one of the most important, gratitude. I'm telling you right now that it's impossible to be happy in this life if you don't first know how to be grateful for the blessings that you already have. This isn't a difficult principle to understand. It's why we teach our children to say please and thank you whenever we give them things, so that they won't turn out to be ungrateful when they grow up. We want our kids to understand that they really don't have a right to receive nice things. Yes, we want to give them that ice cream cone, but they don't have a right to it. It's not owed to them. They have to say please and thank you because they need to know that the ice cream cone and the video games and the computer games and the dolls and the toys and all the rest are gifts. We give them to our children out of love, out of a desire that we have to make them happy, not just because they want them. Now, what happens when we don't teach our children to be thankful? They come to expect everything, don't they? They come to have no appreciation for the gifts they receive. They come to think that whatever they want, they deserve, that whatever they desire is theirs by birthright. And heaven help their hapless parents if they don't get what they want, because that's when the crying starts, and the sulking, and the whining, and the tantrums. When children aren't taught gratitude, they become spoiled little brats. Have you ever witnessed the spectacle of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum when he doesn't get what he wants? It's not very pretty, is it? Well, I hate to break this to you, but guess what most of us are? We're spoiled brats too. Spoiled adult brats. Sure, we say please and thank you sometimes to other adults. But when it comes to being grateful for the most important things in life, for all the blessings that are given to us on a daily basis, we act exactly the same as ungrateful children. What I'm going to say now may sound like a cliche, but it's the truest cliche you'll ever hear. Life is a miracle, a miracle. And yet people have completely lost the wonder of life. They don't really, truly appreciate it. And so all the other wonderful things that exist in the world have lost their meaning too. Let me ask you a question. How did you feel 2,000 years ago when the Roman Empire ruled the world? How did you feel 100 years ago before you were born? How did you feel just one moment before you were conceived? I'll tell you what you felt. You felt nothing. You thought nothing. You were nothing. When you go about your usual routine every day and get caught up in the million tedious details of life, it's so easy to forget this momentous fact. It's so easy to slip into a mode of ingratitude. But you can't forget it. You can't allow yourself to forget it. You were once nothing, and now you're something. And being something is better than being nothing. True happiness begins and ends with gratitude for life. Everything after that is just icing on the cake. If you don't get this point, you can forget about happiness. But if you remind yourself of it every day, then at least there's a chance that you can be grateful for all the other blessings in your life. We all have blessings, even those of us who are suffering. Try a little exercise. Put aside your problems for a second and take a quick inventory of all the good things in your life. I know it might seem corny to do this, but go ahead anyway. Do you have your health, for instance? And by that, I don't mean are you free of ailments. I mean, are you able to eat? Are you able to move? Do you have adequate food and shelter? Do you have the gift of intelligence? Or do you have any other talents? Are you free from serious mental or psychological problems? Are you able to read, to speak, to ask questions, to learn things? Do you have any family or friends, anyone you love or who loves you? Have they ever taught you anything? Have they ever done anything kind for you? Have you ever laughed and had fun with them? What about animals? Have you had any pets in your life? Have you ever been the recipient of the unconditional love of a dog? What about all the experiences you've had, good and bad? Have they taught you anything? What about the beauty of nature? Not just sunsets and mountains and waterfalls and lakes and beaches and oceans, but also all the quiet blessings in life. The joy of simply taking a walk in the woods or reading a good book or drinking a cup of hot chocolate on a cold winter's night. All of these are blessings from God, and all of them should be appreciated for what they are, freely bestowed gifts. So what's the solution? How do we flick on the gratitude switch? It's not always so easy to do. It takes a lot of hard work, and it doesn't happen overnight. In order to cultivate an attitude of gratitude, it takes practice and discipline. First of all, to be in a constant state of appreciation, you have to constantly ask yourself the question, what am I grateful for? And every day you have to ask yourself what you're most grateful for. Do you do that? If not, you got to start. Second, you have to force yourself to say please and thank you more, not just to each other, but to God. Grace before meals is just the minimum. Most people don't even do that nowadays, especially when they're at restaurants, because they don't want anyone to think that they're religious fanatics, God forbid. But Christians should have more guts than that. G.K. Chesterton, who spent his whole life writing about gratitude, went even further and said a short prayer of thanksgiving before going to concerts, before reading books, before admiring sunsets, before sketching or swimming, even before taking a walk. Why not do the same? Third, if you want to feel gratitude, you have to sometimes feel what it's like to do without. You have to occasionally deny yourself what you're legitimately permitted to do. In other words, you have to fast. Fasting is a powerful way to help you to appreciate things in life that you sometimes take for granted. And I'm not just talking about fasting from particular foods. I'm talking about fasting from any activity that you enjoy. Try fasting from your email or your cell phone or your Facebook page once in a while. In the same way, you should sometimes force yourself to do things that are inconvenient. If you have a dishwasher, for example, you should occasionally wash the dishes by hand. If you have a car, you should sometimes take the bus to work. I hear people say all the time that they need a bigger car because their family is growing. But that's not true. They don't need a bigger car. They want a bigger car. Just look at that poor woman, down the block with the 4 kids piling onto a bus with bags and strollers. Sure, it's great to have a bigger car, but only if you appreciate that it's better than having no car at all. So from this moment on, why not make a solemn pledge to be more grateful for everything you've been given in life? No matter what your problems, make a real effort to remember that you're already rich. You already have wealth and abundance. In fact, when it comes to the blessings of God, you're already a billionaire. Gravity. As a principle, gravity is so fundamental and so important, it transcends physics and has applications in philosophy, psychology, even theology. And the reason is that all things in life have a tendency to fall. This is especially true when it comes to our efforts to be virtuous. As we've said already, human resolve can be pretty pathetic sometimes. We all know how easily we fall back into our old habits and vices and how happily we revel in the mud. I'm talking about the tendency human beings have to sink to their lowest level. I'm talking about spiritual gravity, the universal tendency we all have to sin, caused by something in our own human nature which is broken, tainted, and fallen. Remember the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Our secular culture dismisses it as a silly myth, but it's not. There are many profound spiritual truths contained in that story. Recall that in the book of Genesis, God created the first man and woman and placed them in the middle of paradise. At the time, there was no such thing as suffering or death. Adam and Eve were happy, and God gave them complete freedom to do anything they liked, except one thing. He forbade them to eat from a certain tree in the middle of the garden because he said its fruit would kill them. That's really the key point to understand. What God was essentially saying was that human beings were created to have a lot of freedom. But there are limits to that freedom. You can't do anything you want any time you want. That's not freedom at all. That's license. Well, we know how the story ended. Adam and Eve chose to disobey God and eat the forbidden fruit. And it was because of that free, prideful decision that suffering entered the world and was passed on to future generations of mankind. In rejecting God, our first parents lost everything that went along with being in union with God, including perfect happiness on earth. And what they gained was sickness, corruption, war, loneliness, old age, disease, and death. And they got something else too, a weakened human will and the tendency to sin. Theologians call it concupiscence. And unless you understand that every human being is subject to it, you'll never grasp why self-improvement techniques and other forms of psychotherapy never seem to work permanently. You see, no matter how motivated you may be to change for the better, and no matter how much progress you make, there's always a force trying to drag us down. It's part of our very nature, and it originated when human beings first fell from God's grace. That's why humility is so important in the spiritual life. After all, you're a weak, sinful, fallen human being. You're not perfect, and you never will be. When you're truly humble, you're not surprised when you commit a sin, even if it's an extremely serious sin, and even if you've committed the same sin many, many times. That doesn't mean that you're not sorry or that you're not committed to changing. Of course you have to change. Of course you have to make progress and become more disciplined and more virtuous. Of course you have to firmly resolve to turn away from your sins. That's one of the prerequisites of being forgiven, the decision to try to stop your bad behavior. But at the very same time, you have to recognize the truth that you're really just a puny, powerless human being, and you don't have any real strength apart from what God gives you when you're in union with Him. Believe me, if you fall into despair over some offense you've committed, it's a sure sign of spiritual pride. It's a sure sign that you think that you're stronger than you actually are. If you were truly humble, you would never beat yourself up. Instead, you would pick yourself up and try your best not to do it again. I can't say this strongly enough. When it comes to your moral failures, you've got to employ what Mother Angelica used to call the D&D system. Do it and drop it. You've got to try with all your might to resist temptation. But if you give in and do it, then you've got to immediately say you're sorry and drop it. You should never get too upset and never, ever lose hope in God's mercy. After all, the door to confession is always open. Remember, God's been watching human beings commit the same sins for thousands of years. There's nothing you can do that will shock Him. He's seen it all. Now, of course, the best thing you can do when faced with any kind of immoral temptation is to stomp it out before it gets too strong. It might seem obvious, but all big sins in life start out very small. A tiny decision to engage in some harmless flirtation at the office can put a process in motion that eventually leads to an extramarital affair. A little fudging on the books to avoid an embarrassing financial situation can eventually lead to tax fraud. A choice to keep brooding over a frustrating family problem can lead to a terrible outburst of anger and rupture in family relations. So if you want to avoid big falls, you've got to work on those smaller ones first. If there's an intruder at the door and he wants to come in and hurt you, you've got to keep the door locked and bolted. The moment you open it, even an inch, you've given the intruder a chance to force his way in. And the more you open it, the harder it is to keep it closed, the harder it is to resist the power of the intruder as he pushes his way through. The only way to really prevent a break-in is to stop it at the beginning. That has to be your attitude towards sin. If you don't stop them at the beginning, not only can they lead to bigger sins later on, but they might also lead to habitual sins and compulsions and even serious addictions. Anyone suffering from an addiction, whether it's drugs or alcohol or gambling or sex, knows how much havoc it can wreak in your life. Addictions can destroy your health, your self-esteem, your family and friendships. They can sap you of all your energy, rob you of your emotional and spiritual power. They can cause you to waste years and even decades of your life. They're deadly in every way. Have you ever seen a gerbil when it's in a cage, running on one of those spinning wheels? Sometimes people who have addictions feel just like that. Once they start a binge, once they get caught on that wheel of compulsion, it's almost impossible for them to stop. Either they have to be thrown off because of some huge problem that their behavior has caused, or they literally fall off from exhaustion. Then they go through the same cycle again, binging, getting into trouble, breaking down from guilt or exhaustion, recuperating for a time, and then starting all over again. It's a terrible way to live. Sometimes these poor people really sink into despair. They think that God hates them and could never forgive them for their sins. But of course, God loves them and is always anxious to forgive them. He understands them and their compulsions better than they understand themselves. And so He forgives them whenever they're sorry, even if they fall 1,000,000 times. But that doesn't change the fact that addictions cause damage. Yes, God's mercy is infinite and will always help in the healing process that follows a person's falls, but he isn't going to completely erase the destruction that's already been done. And he won't always restore the precious time that's been lost in the person's life either. For these reasons and more, if you've got some kind of unhealthy compulsion or addiction, you've got to make it your first priority in life to seek professional help right now. You can't wait another week or even another day. You've got to bite the bullet and find someone who can help you. In this digital world of ours, this information age, there's no excuse not to. You're literally one internet click away from expert assistance for any problem you may have. Now, later in this series, we're going to be talking about the assistance that God offers in these situations. After all, there are some powerful spiritual weapons that you can employ to help overcome even the worst problems. But let's cover the final G first. It's been said that there are 3 types of people in the world: those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who wonder what happened. What category do you fall into? You don't want it to be number 2 or 3, do you? And yet, that's where the bulk of humanity usually ends up spending most of its time. How do you avoid it? The personal development industry says that the answer is to set goals for yourself so you can accomplish great things and make your dreams into reality. And that's good thinking, as far as it goes. There's a tremendous amount of common sense behind goal setting. So many people have no clue what they want in life, much less how to go about getting it. Then there are folks who do have a general idea what they want, but they never get around to the hard work of making their vague desires into specific, achievable objectives. They forget a very simple rule in life: you can't hit a target if you don't have a bullseye. Goal setting gives you that bullseye to aim for, but unfortunately, there's a problem with it. A problem the personal development industry, predictably, never brings up. As you carefully map out your own goals, you also have to consider what God's goals for you might be. Remember, God's already in the future. He already knows what will make you happy and what won't. Without taking His will into account, you're only really working on half the equation. That's why so many people who achieve success today are still unhappy. That's why so many people who are rich and famous still commit suicide. Why would they kill themselves if they had realized all their goals? Obviously, their goals didn't make them happy. They got caught in the world's trap. They followed their plan instead of God's. The question is, what's the best strategy to go about setting your goals in a way that's both humanly effective and spiritually intelligent? How do you combine the two? What I'd like to do now is give you the basic principles of goal setting. And to my mind, there are really only 3. The first and most important rule is that you have to come up with goals that inspire you. Your goals have to be big enough, interesting enough, and exciting enough to make you really want to achieve them. After all, life is tough. There are so many obstacles to overcome. There's just no way you're ever going to accomplish anything significant if you're not willing to endure some real suffering. And the only way to do that is to be motivated enough to push through the pain and the tedium and the adversity that you're bound to face. Now, in order to come up with goals that inspire you, you've got to ask yourself some serious questions, and you've got to be honest about the answers. What is it that you really want to achieve in life? What is it that you really love? What is it that gives you the most joy? What is it that gives you the most peace? Forget about what the world says you should want. Forget about what's best or most impressive. You have to be brutally honest. What is it that you truly desire in your heart of hearts? If you're able to come up with a few concrete answers, at least you'll have some indication of what God might want for you. God often plants intense desires in our heart to help lead us where He wants us to go. You can't always be sure they're from Him, of course, but if you sincerely get joy and fulfillment from doing something, and it's not sinful, then it might very well be a sign that God wants you to at least explore the area more. So with that in mind, what is it you really want? Do you want to meet the love of your life? Do you want to have a better relationship with your children? Do you want to revitalize your marriage? Do you want to be as fit and energetic as possible? Do you want to do everything you can to be alive and healthy when your great grandkids come along? you want to travel the world or write a book or maybe learn a new language? Do you want to own your own business maybe or your own home? What do you want to do to improve yourself or help your family and your friends? And as long as you don't get too attached to material possessions, what are some things you might want to own? I'm not talking here about status symbols or fancy labels. I'm talking about things you and your family will genuinely enjoy, things that will help you to have fun, things that won't warp your sense of what's valuable in life, because all material possessions are ultimately valueless. But if you can adopt the right perspective, if you can own things and not be owned by them, then of course it's nice to have a boat or a beautiful wardrobe of clothes or a getaway home on some tropical island. Those are all fine goals if you have enough character and humility to handle them. The second principle of goal setting is that you have to write all these things down and put them in a place where you'll remember to look at them. This is a more important step than you may realize. Most people today don't have written goals at all. And the ones who usually do usually look at them only once a year, on New Year's. Then they put them in a drawer and they don't look at them for another 12 months. But what if you review your goals every single day? Don't you think that would make a big difference in terms of how many of them you would end up achieving? Of course it would. Just reading them over at regular intervals will cause you to move towards them. Knowing clearly what you want and why will sharpen that inner subconscious GPS that all of us possess. And that brings us to the third and final goal-setting principle, taking action. If you want anything meaningful in life, you have to work at it. God is not about to drop something magnificent into your lap simply because you happen to desire it. He just doesn't do that. Sometimes overly spiritual people think that all they have to do to get what they want is pray for it. But that's nonsense. You have to pray and work in order to achieve anything that's worthwhile. Remember, Jesus Christ didn't save the world just by praying. Sure, he prayed a lot, but he also spent a great deal of his time acting. Read the Gospels and see if I'm lying. Christ was always healing people and performing miracles and preaching to the crowds and moving here, there, and everywhere. In other words, he was always working. He was always busy doing his Father's will. And if he had to work hard in order to accomplish his objective, then we're going to have to do the same for all our objectives. Doesn't that make sense? So when you go about setting your goals, you always have to create a list of action steps to go along with them. I can't tell you what those steps should be because I don't know your goals. I can only tell you to consult with people you trust and people who have already achieved similar goals. I can only tell you to do research and avoid reinventing the wheel. I can only tell you that you need to take as much action as possible and that you need to start immediately after you set your goal in order to build momentum. You've simply got to get the steamroller moving if you're ever going to overcome all the obstacles that will inevitably be thrown in your path. Finally, I can only tell you that if you're praying constantly for God's guidance, then that same God is very likely to inspire you with the best possible action steps to take. We've already said that the human soul is made in the image and likeness of God. So when you're in union with him, you're in union with the source of all creative power. You're actually tapping into creative genius. A human mind connected to God is really like a giant supercomputer. If the goals you set are in line with what God wants for you, then when you ask him what direction to go, he's going to give you the right answer. That's why we always have to include him in all our major planning and decision making. Not only will he help us to go in the right direction, but if we start going down the wrong path, he'll put roadblocks in our way that we won't be able to overcome. That's such an important point to understand. Not every dream you have is God's will for you. In fact, very often, your dream is not your destiny. Lots of people dream about being artists or actors or musicians, for instance, but it's actually the wrong path for them to take. God may have given them a powerful clue about their destiny, but that's just what it was, a clue. In order to draw us in closer to him, God leaves it up to us to prayerfully discern the specific goal that his clues point to. And many times, we can misinterpret God's clues, especially if we're not praying regularly. That happened to me. From the time I was a little boy, I wanted to be a doctor. I really, really wanted to be a heart surgeon. And I might have succeeded, too, if a couple of little things didn't get in the way. like organic chemistry and integral calculus, and girls. Now, when that dream of mine didn't work out, I was very disappointed, and I went back to another great ambition I always had, which was to be a writer. But I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be, so I just took any writing job that came along. I wasn't very happy, and I was really kind of lost. Then, sometime in my 20s, after years of being away from the faith, I started to get more interested in Christianity. I finally started praying to God to lead me in the right direction. And that's when I realized that maybe there was a way I could combine both of these great ambitions of my life. I realized that maybe God had given me the desire to be a doctor and the desire to be a writer for a reason. Perhaps I could still help people who were sick, maybe not with surgery, but with writing. That was a big revelation to me. For so many years, I thought that I wanted to be a doctor, but I was wrong. My true desire wasn't to be a doctor at all. It was to be a healer of a different kind. Like many people, though, I had interpreted the clues God had given me incorrectly. I only started to get the right interpretation when I started to pray. You can do that too. You can achieve whatever goals you set for yourself, no matter how big, as long as God is behind you and you aren't afraid to work hard and pray hard. That's the most effective combination in the world. So even if you've had the experience of setting goals before, it's time to start fresh and try again. This time with an intelligent, written plan, and most importantly, with the cooperation of God. My friend, this can be a very important day for you. Be creative, be daring, be holy. Find some time to get away for an afternoon and just focus on this subject alone, and then start setting some inspiring goals for yourself. I'm Anthony DeStefano, and this is A Travel Guide to Life. See you next time.